Muito obrigada. Infelizmente não vamos já para a parceria do café, depois temos o coffee break servido quando sairmos. Eu vinha só agradecer a vossa atenção, dizendo que vamos fazer aqui uma pequena alteração ao programa, ou seja, os dois painéis que faltam vão ser invertidos e vamos desde já entrar em contacto com Boston, onde nos aguarda o professor Filipe Altbach, que por estar a intervir a partir de Boston tem uma hora marcada que nós vamos respeitar, sendo que a moderadora e o painel que entraria agora gentilmente se deu a vez e, portanto, vamos fazer esta troca. Como já perceberam, também é da praxe, o programa resvalou ligeiramente, mantemos aquilo que tínhamos pensado, portanto, temos o autocarro à espera, seja a que horas for que acabe o evento, para irmos para o nosso jantar, onde podemos finalmente fazer uma parceria com o café e com o vinho. Muito obrigada.
Olá a todos. Olá a todos. Não? Sim? Olá a todos, muito boa tarde. O dia é longo e intenso, espero que estejam todos bem, até porque chegámos a um dos pontos altos deste programa. Este programa que também é intenso, de 3 dias. Vamos contar com uma autoridade científica no que diz respeito à área da internacionalização do ensino, sobretudo o ensino superior. Vamos poder ouvir o professor Philip G. Altbach, que eu já vos vou apresentar daqui a pouco. Eu tentava só que o conseguíssemos ver. Sim. Penso que estamos mesmo em cima da hora marcada. O professor deve conseguir ver a sala. Sim. Hello, Professor Altbach, can you hear me?
Hello.
Hear me?
Yes.
Hello.
Okay.
Good morning to you in Boston. It's late afternoon for us here in Portugal. I hope you can see the room and see all the lovely people here gathered to listen to you. We've been discussing many issues concerning internationalization of higher education today, and your input will be highly valued. But first, I would like to introduce you to everybody here so that everybody is fully aware of who they will be listening to. So Professor Philip G. Altbach is the Research Professor and Distinguished Fellow at the Center for International Higher Education at Boston College, where from 1994 to 2015, he was the Monon University Professor. He was the 2004-2006 Distinguished Scholar Leader for the New Century Scholars Initiative of the Fulbright Program. He has taught at Harvard University, the University of Wisconsin, and the State University of New York at Buffalo. He is also author of Global Perspectives on Higher Education, Student Politics in America, among other books. He has also co-edited with Jamil Salmi, The Road to Academic Excellence, with Michael Bastido and Patricia Gamport, American Higher Education in the 21st Century, the International Handbook of Higher Education, and other books. Philip Altbach holds the BA, MA, and PhD degrees from the University of Chicago. Professor, we're all ears, and we'd like to know from you about current trends in higher education and internationalization. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be speaking with you. I'm only sorry that I'm not actually there in Portugal, which would be very nice for me. But here I am in Boston, where it is springtime also. I would like to spend about 20 minutes talking about aspects of internationalization, which I think affect us all in the context of a very, very difficult and changing both academic and geopolitical context in the world at the moment. Of course, relating in part to the current tragic situation in Ukraine, but also broader issues as well. And what I'm going to try to do is to talk about what I call the 5 C's of the internationalization crisis. And those C's stand for what I'm referring to as the new Cold War, COVID, climate, China, and commercialization. And I will discuss all of those with a little bit of detail in a few minutes. I am going to try to be pretty brief so that we can engage in as much of an actual conversation as possible, not just Q&A, which I'm happy to respond to, but also to get your views on how these issues which I mentioned, and maybe some others, affect you and whether you think these are key issues. Let me first do something which is maybe overly simple-minded, and that is to define internationalization in higher education. And my definition, not original to me actually, is the intentional process of integrating an international, intercultural, or global dimension into the purpose, functions, and delivery of post-secondary education in order to enhance the quality of education and research for all students and staff, and to make a useful, meaningful contribution to society. Of course, it's much more complicated than that as well, with commercialization and many of the other things which I will be discussing. But I think it's important to keep the basic goal in mind, and I know that this is the context of the entire conference, which is going on now, and which I have the honor to be talking to you now. Internationalization is, of course, an artifact, a part of both globalization and massification in higher education. And it's very important, of course, to keep that context in mind. There are about more than 200 million students studying worldwide, and that number is expected to increase, and the fact of that increase will be mainly in middle income and developing countries, and it will be largely in just 2 countries, and you can guess which they are, India and China, especially India, in the coming period. And the expansion which has occurred in the last 20 years or so is unprecedented, of course, in world history. Part of the reason, and this is important for thinking about internationalization, for this expansion, is the rise of a global middle class. In other words, more people around the world are able to afford to send their sons and daughters to higher education. So expansion has been part of it. Global mobility, which of course Erasmus has very much stimulated and is part of, has increased dramatically. There are more than 5 million students who are studying outside the borders of their own countries with many different reasons and purposes, but the number is very big and the number is likely to increase, although I think at a slower rate than has been the case in recent years. And in addition to those 5 million students, there are many, and we don't know how many, postdocs and junior faculty and some senior faculty who are working outside the borders of their own countries. So mobility is key. Science, of course, has become more internationalized. And of course, we have seen the interlinking of economies, globalization, we put, as we say. And that interlinking, I think, is in the process of some change and maybe some, as the economists say, decoupling in the coming period. And I think that will have some impact on mobility and on internationalization in general. I think that the European economies may become more strongly linked in the coming period, and this may be have a significant impact on the work that you do with Erasmus and other programs. But with now the rise of populism and nationalism, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, of course, the partial closing of China, all of these will affect, I think, globalization. They will not end it, not at all, but they will affect some changes. And nobody knows exactly how that is going to play out in the coming period. And that's why this conference, and in general what we do for our work now, is both complicated and, of course, exciting. So let me proceed with my 5 C's and just briefly present what I think are some of the implications. And I am very interested to hear your reactions and how you think these may affect you. The first is what I call the new Cold War. And this not only affects the Russian war in Ukraine, which I do think is going to have some significant impact in the, both definitely in the short run, but also in the medium and long run. And we may well see a return to the sort of traditional Cold War way of dealing with Russia in the coming period, where the Russians are in many ways in their own academic bubble, their own context, with significantly less interaction with the rest of the world. I don't know how this is going to play out, but it will have some impact. Other aspects of that Cold War, of course, are a decoupling of particularly the United States from China and its economy, but that also is having some effect, and I think will have a future effect also on mobility issues and scientific collaboration between the US and China going forward. And I'll be talking about China a little bit in a few minutes too. So I think we're seeing an end to the optimism, complete optimism about globalization and about our work in international higher education than we've we've had during your lifetimes, and even, I'm a bit older, and even most of my lifetime. And I think we're seeing some change. How it will turn out, I don't really know. The second point is COVID. Of course, we hope we're toward the end of the major part of the COVID crisis, but it's going to be with us in some respect even going forward. And it has had a significant impact, and I think in some ways a lasting impact, at least for the medium term, on higher education around the world. I'll just point out now to a few of the elements that I think are important. COVID has reduced mobility all around the world, and how long that will continue, I do not know. COVID has particularly affected the non-elite sectors of societies and countries and universities, and I think this is highly problematical and something that those of us in the international higher education area need to think about as we think about our own role and serving our students going forward. I think that the elite sector of higher education, that is the research-intensive universities, the so-called world-class universities in different countries, are going to survive just fine the COVID crisis, but I think there will be more problems both for the universities and for the populations that they serve in the non-elite higher education sectors. COVID will increase, I think, the use of distance education provision around the world, and I think especially what we call hybrid teaching and learning going forward, and how that will affect your work in terms of professionals in the mobility area is not exactly clear. I do not think that distance education and the implications of COVID are going to cause a revolution in higher education, as some observers have noted, and that the universities in the coming period are going to look very much like the universities do right now. There have been many times in the past half century or more where many people have talked about the crisis of higher education and predicted that our sector would not survive or that it would be dramatically changed. And guess what? It hasn't. It has changed in some ways, but not fundamentally. And I don't think that the long-term implications of COVID are going to create that kind of revolution. But there are significant elements now of instability in student mobility and in teaching and learning and in the financing in some countries of higher education that COVID has introduced and will have an effect. Let me move to climate. Many people talk about sustainability in the higher education sector and in the broader society. And indeed, we do have a existential crisis, as we all read in the media these days, and it's true. And it is also the case that we're not moving quickly enough to deal with it. But in our little part of the world, that is in international higher education and mobility, what is the crisis, the climate crisis going to mean? We don't know exactly, like with most of what I'm saying, but some things seem pretty clear to me. One is there will be less short-term mobility, and this particularly affects the United States and countries that have to travel, where students have to travel a long distance to study in a different context. And it may actually be a significant advantage to Europe, where the distances are shorter and mobility is easier. So we don't know. So the climate crisis may increase mobility in Europe, as I've mentioned. All of this will have a significant impact on what I call the internationalization industry, and I will talk about that a bit later. The companies and institutions which are involved in the mobility issues. So climate and sustainability will be increasingly important both for society and for higher education. And those of us involved in various aspects of internationalization need to be concerned about it. Let me move on and talk about the next C, which is China. China, of course, is a huge player in international higher education in so many ways. It is the largest higher education system in the world, and it will be continuing to grow. The top universities in China, in which have gotten much better and are now truly world-class institutions. So we need to understand the complexities of a really complicated higher education system that most of us outside China really don't know about how it works. And I think we need to be more aware of that. What kinds of institutions, what are the curricular trends, and so on. At the moment in China, there is a rethinking, for example, of the role of English in Chinese higher education. Up until recently, their national entrance exam, which is certainly the largest examination taken by people on the face of this planet, had a required English element, and the Chinese are now thinking about de-emphasizing that, or some are even arguing to eliminate it. China is now a major host country for the first time, and China has an aggressive policy of attracting students from other countries to China and are providing very large numbers of scholarships to those students. There are now 500,000 international students in China, almost all of them from developing and middle-income countries, most of them relating to the so-called Belt and Road Initiative of the Chinese government. But China is increasingly looking to increase the number of international students. I do not think that there will be significant numbers from Europe or North America going to China to take degrees, but the short-term mobility to China will probably continue as it should. There is a significant disengagement from China, at least from some countries, especially the United States, Australia, and some European Union countries. This is related to political and economic tensions, but it was even beginning before that. The Chinese global numbers have declined to some extent in recent years, and they will, I think, continue to decline. So mobility from China will probably still be a very significant force in international higher education, but the growth rate has already slowed and may well stop. So that's interesting. The issues of intellectual property and the theft of intellectual property is a real issue. It's not a crisis, and I think the American government, especially during the administration of Mr. Trump, overemphasized it dramatically, but it's there, and it affects all, especially the countries that are producing lots of high technology, such as the US, but it affects many parts of the world. And finally, about China, there is some closing of China from the inside. With the current government of President Xi Jinping has put more and more restrictions on sharing of knowledge, on access to the internet, on academic freedom within Chinese universities, and so on. And these are issues of some importance, as China is a global scientific power in its own right these days. How that will in the long run work out, I'm not sure. And certainly China is not going to close itself off completely, but it is a key issue. And my final C, and here I will conclude, is what I and others have called the commercialization of internationalization. And that in some ways has changed the nature of our industry, if you want to call it that, in some ways. Some countries, mostly not in the EU, think of international students as a commodity, as we say, cash cows. The Australians are the most dramatic example of that, but the Brits, and to a lesser extent the Americans, also think of international students in significant ways of a way of making money. As I say, this is less the case in EU countries. We have had in recent years the role of agents and recruiters. I do not know if Portugal or other European Union countries heavily use agents and recruiters, that is, private sector people in sending countries who recruit students to go to particular universities and are paid a lot of money to do that. And there's a lot of controversy and some significant amount of dishonesty in that part of the industry. We've seen the development of branch campuses and franchise degrees. There are some 400 branch campuses all around the world now, and countries like India, which never had branch campuses before, are now opening them in a number of other countries. And what does that all mean? How do we manage franchising degrees, joint degrees, between a university in country A and a university in country B? It's all complicated, and too much of it, in my opinion, is commercially driven. And finally, there is this commercialization has brought significant instability to some countries, like Australia, where universities have become dependent on funds from international students. So, to conclude, we are at, I think, an inflection point, a point of significant change and significant uncertainty in the whole area of internationalization. And how we're going to deal with that in the short run and in the medium run, I don't really know. I do not think fundamentally that there are going to be vast changes in how we do our business or in the numbers of mobile students or faculty or postdocs worldwide, but there are going to be some changes in the middle of all this. So we are in a period of change, and I think all of us need to be concerned with how we're going to deal with that change. And I hope that at least I've brought some key issues to your attention and that you at least remember these important C's of crisis. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Altbach, for your insights. Those 5 C's, I'm sure you raised a lot of questions and also lots of nodding from our audience. And taking your suggestion, I would like to open the mic for comments to our audience. We have international office managers, university managers, and many stakeholders here involved in higher education. So any comments regarding this? Oh, we do have one, of course.
Hello, I'm not sure if you can hear me.
Yes,
Okay,
very
so
good.
I'm Magda. I'm from Universidade Católica Portuguesa, so Catholic University. So we are part of a research alliance with Boston College. And my question regards commercialization. So Professor Altbach was saying that commercialization brought instability. So I actually have two notes. So the first one is branch campuses and franchising degrees. So in my opinion, those branches usually are set in places where there is low offer of qualified education. So in a way, and in my opinion, this could be a positive approach to the lack of opportunities for students locally to have access to quality higher education. The second topic, so this is maybe it's more a note, not a question. And the second topic mentions the instability caused by commercialization of higher education. And when we think about Australia, maybe the problem was that it relied too much on international student fees. Not that it has attracted international students, it's just that maybe it exaggerated. I don't know. I would like to know your thoughts on this. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. And I'll try to be brief in the answers so we can get to as many comments as possible. Yes, in some cases, indeed in many cases, branch campuses bring access in countries where there hasn't been enough, where the market is still not serving all the students who need it. That's true. But many of the purposes of the branch campuses are on the part of the people opening the branches commercial. So we need to know more about the quality that these branches are offering in the different countries. So it's a complicated question, but your points are very well taken. And also, the Indians are now both increasingly active in putting branch campuses in other countries, and are beginning to accept the idea that branch campuses should come to India. And one of the main reasons for that is to bring in new ideas about the management of higher education. So your point about the branches bringing new ideas is correct in some cases, not in all of them. And your point about Australia also is both relevant and quite interesting. The Australian government 20 years ago told the universities, you guys need to recruit more international students because we're cutting your budget. So we expect you to build your budget on the basis of international students. And the Australian universities have been exceedingly successful in doing that up until recent years. Now the Australians and the Chinese are arguing about various things, and Chinese numbers to Australia have declined, bringing with that reality financial crisis for the Australian universities themselves. So your point is, yes, they have come to rely too much on the cash cows.
Hello, Professor. This is Michael Baum, also former resident of Massachusetts. So hello from over here. I really enjoyed your talk, and I just wanted to ask you a question about trends in terms of U.S. students thinking about doing undergraduate degree programs abroad. And I ask this in the sense that there's been, in some ways, kind of the holy grail idea here in Portugal of trying to attract more U.S. undergraduates to come and do undergraduate degrees here because of the huge differential in pricing between, European and U.S. university systems. And my question is whether you think that there's some real potential for that kind of recruitment, or that's really sort of pie in the sky, and given labor market dynamics, et cetera, that it's going to be difficult for U.S. students to do an undergraduate degree and, for example, then come back and have the U.S. labor market recognize that degree.
Yes, my brief answer is pie in the sky, as you correctly put it. There has, of course, always been a tradition of study abroad, and I think, despite what I said about the climate crisis and that will continue, and there'll be many American students wishing to study abroad. One of the points I've made in local publications here is that study abroad, and you are probably well aware of this, has in recent years become not the semester or year abroad, but the 2 weeks abroad, frequently sitting in an Irish pub rather than some serious educational content. And I think that short-term study abroad does need to end, really. And I think that it may not end, but it's going to be severely curtailed. So we're going to have more meaningful study abroad. But in terms of Americans, and for that matter, Canadians too, doing degrees overseas, there's never been a tradition of that. As you correctly point out, our labor market, which is in many ways quite insular, despite the fact of all the immigration that we have here, will have trouble figuring out what a degree means from Portugal or almost any place else. Yes, you can go do an undergraduate degree at Oxford, and that will probably fly, but maybe almost no place else.
Speaking of internationalization, Professor Altbach, you spoke about several different regional markets, and you mentioned your prospects for some of them in the future. And knowing about the European Universities Initiative of the European Union, I don't know if you've heard about it. We spoke a lot about it here today. So I'd like to know if you think that those plans of creating big regional, across Europe, creating many different European universities, do you think that will bring Europe to a higher position in the global market? Will it attract more international students, or will it just propel the internal European market? What's your view on that?
Well, I don't know enough about it to answer, to give you a kind of a useful answer from your point of view. Efforts to create cross-border universities have not been particularly successful, neither in Europe nor elsewhere. Linking universities, I know of some very successful in my own little area of higher education in the European context. Some very good programs which link several different European universities, and students go study in several of them. Those, I think, have a lot of promise. So I can't talk more about that. Let me mention one other topic which didn't fit into my 5 C's because it doesn't start with a C, and that's the role of English, and how European countries, and for that matter the globe, fits into what I've called global English. There's been some discussion, partly a little bit from me and my friend Professor Postiglione in Hong Kong, about the role of Chinese as a global language. And our argument is, and some disagree, that ain't going to happen. I mean, English is the global language of science now. But I think the interesting issue and worth discussing, maybe not in this context, but to think about, is how English language degree programs in different countries. I know some countries have different approaches to that. I can tell you from my own long experience in this field, when I started out, which I won't tell you how many years ago that was, and I went to a conference in Europe, there were papers given in German and French and sometimes Spanish and English, and everybody was supposed to understand them. And nowadays, and this is true for this conference, you are all sitting around listening to me, I hope, and understanding in English, and nobody's using, if there is a translation, nobody needs to use it. So that's an indication of how things have gone. But that's one thing. The other thing is, what does a country like Portugal, for example, want to do about English medium courses? It's an interesting question and not an easy one to answer.
Hi, Phil. This is your past calling. This is Laura Rumbley in the audience. Very nice to see you here. I'll wave a hand. You mentioned India in passing, as a part of this very interesting global dynamic. And you are an India watcher for decades now. A new national education plan there that features a lot of emphasis on internationalization and opening up to the wider world. I was wondering if you might have a few comments about what you think about some of those developments, and particularly what that might mean for European higher education institutions, perhaps engaging more and getting more into that context.
Yes, thank you very much, Laura. It's very nice to see the back of your head. Yes, India is going through a very, very serious set of proposals, most of which are actually backed with some money by the government to make some changes. And I won't go into all of them because it's highly complicated, but a significant part of it is about internationalization. And what the Indians are trying to do several things. One is they are, and they're quite clear about saying this, they want to expand their, quote, soft power, unquote, around the world. And they're really pushing Indian universities to establish relationships and branches, mainly in Africa, and to some extent in other South Asian countries, and a little bit extent in the Middle East. Not much focus on Europe, because I think they realize that they can't really be super competitive in the European context. So there is significant change going on there. And for the first time, and it's really interesting to me, as you say, I've been watching India for half a century. It's the first time that the Indians are talking about opening themselves up to branch campuses and to other kinds of collaboration. They've really opened the door on joint degrees. And if I were making any recommendations to European universities, that would be the kind of initiative which I think would be not so difficult, not so tough to understand, more likely to succeed with some good Indian universities in establishing joint degree programs and franchise arrangements and so on and so forth. So I think that's interesting. They have technically opened the door to branch campuses, but in my opinion, it's not going to work. The current legislation is, if you want to be a branch campus in India, you have to be in the top 100 of one of the global rankings to go in the door. And none of the top 100 are going to want to go in that door. And in general, the Indians will need to provide some resources to anybody who wants to enter the market there. And there's no sign that they're doing that. So what's positive is that they're talking about it for the first time and not being totally closed. It used to be, by the way, in my day, that that a foreigner could not get an academic appointment of any sort in an Indian university. And now that's been changed, so they can't have a tenured appointment, but they can have some kinds of appointments. So India is very much behind the global trends, but they're finally opening up.
Thank you, Professor Altbach. You actually killed my last question, because I was going to ask you for a recommendation or advice for university managers and other stakeholders here present. So thank you anyway for your insights. You covered a lot of issues and burning issues for us here today. And it's really an honor for us to have you in this event. I think I'm speaking on behalf of everybody when saying this. Thank you for all your work, and thank you for being with us today from Boston.
Totally my pleasure. Thank you for asking me, and I really enjoyed the conversation. Thanks.